Tonight on Nation to Nation, a new report exposes how Quebec is the latest province where forced sterilization was done to Indigenous women. The report's co-author tells us what healthcare professionals told the victims.
You have too many children. Every children you have are going to end up in poverty. You should just close your legs next time so you won't have any more children.
Oil, gas, and mining projects often go hand in hand with violence against Indigenous women.
The response to the violence is a contributor, as well as we often do see racism in frontline policing and male toxicity in that industry as well.
Parliament is currently debating a proposed law to create National Council for Reconciliation.
It's going to hold governments to account. It's also going to establish multi-year plans for further achievement and problem-solving efforts.
Ani, hello, I'm Annette Francis, and welcome to Nation. Forced sterilization of Indigenous women is well known across Canada. It's the subject of several class action lawsuits, but less well known is if it was happening in Quebec. Unknown until now. A report was released recently that seeks to answer that question. It's called Free and Informed Consent and Imposed Sterilizations. One of its co-authors is Patricia Bouchard. She joins us now. Welcome to Nation, Ms. Bouchard.
Thank you.
The report found 22 cases of forced sterilization in Quebec since 1980. Some people might say it doesn't sound like a lot, so how significant is this finding?
It is the first study of its kind on the subject in Quebec. So it's the first testimony we've been able to gather, and we have to say that we begin the collection of testimonies during COVID. So we planned a lot of trips to go to communities, to meet people in person, but unfortunately it wasn't possible because many communities were closed. So we know that there's at least 40 other, not 40, sorry about that, at least 20 other people that would have been able to participate if we could have met them in person. So I think this is only the tip of the iceberg. And as we saw in other provinces, every time there was a report or there was people coming up that were raising these issues in the media, other people came forward and said, this happened to me too. So maybe it's going to snowball from there.
Can this be considered another instance of systemic racism in Quebec's healthcare system?
I think so, yes, because it speaks to a continuum of violences. And many participants also experience not only forced sterilization, but also obstetrical violence when it comes to looks, when it comes to attitudes, when it comes to things that were said to them that were really discriminatory and they made them feel unsafe and not properly cared for in this very vulnerable moment that is childbirth. So every time they have contact with the healthcare system, they are paralyzed with fear. There is no trust there, and sometimes they even wait so long to see a physician that their condition gets worse. So yes, we can speak about systemic racism, and all the testimonies also, they come from all parts of Quebec. They come from different regions. They come from the Atikamekw Nation. They come from the Innu. They come from the EU. So yes, it's a global phenomenon that we were able to put the finger on in the province.
There were 35 participants ranging from ages 17 to 46. What was it like to hear a 17-year-old talk about imposed sterilization?
In fact, she wasn't 17 when she talked to me. She was 17 when the sterilization happened. But even still, talking about it, the common denominator was they are sure nobody's going to believe them. They are sure that it's going to be their perspective against one of a doctor, and it's going to be a case of he said, she said. They kept this part of their life in the dark for so long, for fear of being judged, for fear of being stigmatized, for fear of being treated less than because they know they can no longer give life, even though that wasn't their choice. So there's still a lot of pain, a lot of disbelief, and a lot of mistrust towards healthcare providers. So many of them spoke up, not only for them, but in the hopes that this will never happen again to other Indigenous young women and women all across Quebec in Canada. So that was the hope, that was the core message that these ladies had to share with me. I'm sharing this with you because I don't want it to happen again to anyone.
What other types of incidents or experiences did you document?
I talked a bit earlier about obstetrical violence. So many ladies were told, you have too many children. Every children you have are going to end up in poverty. You should just close your legs next time so you won't have any more children. You have already 3, so don't you think that is enough? So a lot of discriminatory regards like that, and also many instances of the disrespect of the free and informed consent of these ladies. So they were proposed the tubal ligation while they were in labor. So it's such a difficult and vulnerable process to be in. This is not the time to weigh in option, to ask question, and to really give an informed consent, because you cannot process all the information. You have medication, you have pain, you have anxiety. There's so many things that can cause barrier to a proper understanding and a proper discussion with the doctor. So some of them were lied to. Basically, they were told, "Oh, this procedure is reversible. Don't worry. If you want to have children in the future, you can." When in fact, it is really difficult to reverse the effect of a tubal ligation. So these ladies, a few years later, when they go seek medical help to become pregnant again, they are totally in shock when they learn that no, in fact, there's no way that they can be pregnant again, because the tissue of their tubes was so badly damaged with the tubal ligation. So this is a situation to me that was particularly startling, because it was a clear attack on their fundamental right as women and as patients navigating the healthcare system. Free and informed consent is essential, no matter what condition you are going to the hospital for. So to see that it was so disregarded and so uncared for, it was really shocking to me.
It's the first such project of the issue, on the issue of imposed sterilizations in Quebec. Why did the provincial government choose not to participate?
Because at the time, it was before COVID, and they basically said that we have no data on the subject in Quebec, so therefore it must not exist. So we know now that this is not actually the case. They also mentioned that healthcare is a provincial matter, when in fact, when it concerns Indigenous people in Quebec, it's a responsibility that is shared with the federal government. So that was their stance. They said they are concerned about it. They said they discussed about it with a few Indigenous organizations, but nothing came of it as far as I know.
Okay. Thank you for joining us, Patricia Bouchard. That's all the questions I have. Miigwech.
Thank you.
After the break, we'll take on the issue of man camps, which result in more violence against Indigenous women. Please stick around. Welcome back. This past year, Parliamentary Committee has been looking at the issue of resource extraction projects and the connection to violence against Indigenous women. The committee is now considering a draft report that will soon be presented to Parliament. Lisa Smith is the Senior Director of Governance for the Native Women's Association of Canada. Back in September, she testified at a Status of Women Committee hearing. Here's a clip of her describing the problem to members of Parliament.
Resource extraction projects usually create environments described as boom towns and man camps, where transient, non-Indigenous men who are paid high salaries come to work on these sites. These sites are reported to have increased rates of sexual violence and human trafficking.
Ani, welcome Lisa Smith to Nation.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you describe exactly what is the link between resource extraction and violence against Indigenous women and girls?
Absolutely. So at the Native Women's Association of Canada, we are highly committed to ending the ongoing genocide that the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls final report identified. And we know that resource extraction and violence against Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people is intrinsically linked to colonialism. And there are reports to suggest that demonstrates rather that this violence does occur. I mean, there are a lot of factors at play here. You know, colonialism obviously being a major factor, but also these man camps, boom towns, they are, there is a culture of male toxicity, and that often bleeds into neighboring Indigenous communities. And the fact that there are high salaries, transient workers, a high rate of alcohol and drug abuse. It's all interrelated. And this unfortunately affects, the safety of Indigenous women and girls. I will add that in my opinion, the response to the violence is a contributor, as well as we often do see racism in frontline policing and male toxicity in that industry as well.
Okay. Do we have any idea how bad Indigenous women are being affected by these resource extraction projects?
Yes, there are reports that do highlight these high rates. And of course, in comparison to the violence against non-Indigenous women, it's very alarming. And again, it goes back to, the MMIWG has reported that the ongoing genocide is related, and it does make that link between resource extraction and the ongoing genocide.
As I mentioned in the introduction, a parliamentary committee will soon be releasing a draft report. What do you hope to see in that report?
I hope to see, truth and reconciliation. And what I mean by that is, identifying those statistics that I said are out there in these reports that document the violence. So when we understand the truth of what is occurring, then we can reconcile. And the thing is, Canada has tools at its disposal. NWAC, we wrote a report after there were changes to the Impact Assessment Act, whereby Indigenous women will have the safety of Indigenous women, girls, gender diverse people has to be a consideration before a minister can make a decision. So that's a tool.
The MMIWG final report that came out 3 years ago also made recommendations about the violence associated with resource extraction. How do you see a parliamentary report either complementing or improving on that?
Right. So respectfully, the calls for justice are a high level, and so I think a report can complement that by getting into the details. How are the industry, how are they to work with provincial, territorial, federal jurisdictions? What does that look like? And because when we do talk about implementation, we do need a level of detail. And so I think, this can be another tool at Canada's disposal to really conquer this problem and really strive for outcomes.
Switching topics, you were a guest on Nation to Nation this past spring when we asked you about the forced sterilization of Indigenous women. Last week, a report came out of Quebec that identified the same problem in that province. Should this be a surprise it's happened there?
Nothing surprises me anymore, unfortunately, and that's the state that we're in and what the MMIWG has made prevalent to all Canadians. It's upsetting, it's alarming, and I think we need to press on all Canadians that it's urgent. These matters are urgent. They're happening. And, so often we hear people think these sorts of abuses happened in our past because oftentimes people relate it to the residential schools and, okay, now the last residential school stopped operating, these sorts of human right violations are no longer happening. They are. And that report demonstrates that. And it just urges us all as Canadians to realize that this is urgent and it's still happening. And it goes back to my earlier point too, that we have tools now, all of us, not just governments, not just civil society, all Canadians must implement the calls for justice immediately.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. Miigwech, thank you, Lisa Smith, for joining us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
After the break, we speak to a librarian at the University of Victoria about the topic of reconciliation. Don't go away. Welcome. This week, Bill C-29 went through third reading in the House of Commons. If it becomes law, it will establish a National Council for Reconciliation, which is supposed to advance and provide oversight on long-term action to reconciliation. It is a response to the call to action number 53 from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report. Joining us to talk about Bill C-29 is Rai Moran. He is currently an Associate Librarian on Reconciliation at the University of Victoria and the former Director of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. Welcome, Rai Moran.
Thanks for having me on. Nice to see you.
You too. First off, what's your role at the university mean to students there?
Yeah, well, it's a new role, and I think it reflects a very sincere commitment by this institution broadly, like many universities, to incorporate new positions within their organizations. My particular role is centered within the libraries here at UVic, which is actually a great position because I get to work with a lot of different faculties, a lot of different groups on campus. I continue to have this role with, these kind of memory keeping practices. So archival records, how we have information for Indigenous peoples, by Indigenous peoples, on Indigenous peoples, presented and accessible. And, there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do to help people access the vitally important Indigenous knowledge systems that are out there that are right at the heart of reconciliation.
And you're halfway through a series of 8 podcasts on reconciliation. What is the purpose of this series?
Well, this podcast that I've been working on is I think trying to address a couple of things. One of them is it's a bit of a deeper response to many of the questions that I was asked in my role as director of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. We got a lot of calls from media all the time. A lot of the times they focused on a number of kind of common themes. So, naming places, what to do with former residential school sites. What truths are we even talking about? Of course, we know very fundamentally, this was right in the TRC's mandate, that truth does come before reconciliation. We're still very much in that time of truth-telling. So this podcast called Tapoyawan, meaning truth-telling, is a very sincere engagement with this concept of truth-telling and thinking about how the truth is manifest, how it's suppressed, and really exploring this relationship between human rights, memory, power, and truth.
As we are recording this interview, Bill C-29 is on the verge of passing third reading and being sent to the Senate for its consideration. What do you think of this piece of legislation?
Well, first of all, I'm pleased to see that it's reached this point. This particular call to action, calling for a national council on reconciliation, has been the clearly articulated priority out of all the calls to action. Because again, coming back to my role when I was at the NCTR, what was one of the most commonly asked questions? Well, how are we doing? And how do we know how we're doing? Where are we at regarding implementation of the TRC's calls to action? Monitoring, accountability, holding the governments to account, holding all sectors of society to account is absolutely paramount. This was reinforced by the United Nations just at the closure of the TRC's reports, release of the TRC's reports at least. This particular call to action is of vital importance because it will keep a very close eye on implementation of the calls to action. It's going to hold governments to account. It's also going to establish multi-year plans for further achievement and problem-solving efforts regarding implementation of those calls to action. We know that there's a lot of work still to do, and this particular effort on the Council for Reconciliation is of vital and critical importance, and it really can't come soon enough.
Have you heard anything from survivors about this council?
I've heard a number of thoughts on the council, and I've certainly heard a lot of thoughts along the way as we've worked up to this point. I mean, I think when we look at major new initiatives like this, one of the things that's very, very important is the principle of independence. This was something, of course, that was of paramount importance in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, and we see that flow through to the council. So being able to be at arm's length to government, because this is fundamentally at its heart an accountability mechanism, is vital. And I think this legislation does achieve that. The second thing always is, will it be able to do its work? Does it have the resources necessary? And I'm going to be watching very closely at how those resources are further allocated moving forward. There are funds set aside. There's some money for startup phase and then also ongoing operations. But I think it's fair to say this council's work is very broad. It's actually a lot of work, and we have to see whether or not this council is properly supported with the financial resources that it needs. Then, of course, there's the question of will it be able to get the information that it also needs as well? We know regarding document production and all sorts of other challenges in the past that governments aren't always necessarily willing to share information, especially when it may not present things in the best of lights.
All right. Miigwech, thank you, Rai Moran, for taking the time. We're going to end it there.
Thanks for having me on.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of this evening's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Annette Francis. Miigwech. Have a good night.
We simply did it by discovering that each and every step in our lives contributing to and effecting reconciliation is huge.